Uh, all right. All right. Very good. So let's pick up where we left off last week. And does anyone need a copy of the study guide? Anyone? I think we still have 3 or 4 copies left. Anyone? Okay. Um, so the study guide helped you follow along, and we are on page 7 of the study guide, A Proper English Education. Now, last week we talked about C.S. Lewis's childhood, some of the trauma involved in his childhood, including the death of his mother when he's only 9 years old. And we'll pick up at that point and go several years beyond this evening. Now, so here's a little 9-year-old. And here's somebody who just has this very, very vivid imagination, as we talked about last week. They live in a very interesting old historic house, lots of little nooks and crannies and whatever. And upstairs, there's this room where his parents rarely ever go. And Lewis and his brother Warney referred to that as the little end room. In other words, it was at the end of a hall. And they loved going in there because they'd be so detached from their parents and could just pretty much do whatever they pleased. And of course, at the end of that room is a big wardrobe, and they enjoyed exploring that as well. And so that concept of the wardrobe is probably quite familiar, those of you who've read his fantasy literature in particular. But 2 weeks after his mother dies, 2 weeks later, he's 9 years old. He's told to pack his bags and go to England. Now, remember, they live in Northern Ireland. And he's sent to a boarding school named called Wynyard School. This was what they call in England a public school. We call it a private school. And it was a very elite school. It was located in Hertfordshire, England. And so again, his mother's been dead, had passed away 2 weeks earlier, and he sent off all by himself to England. His father, of course, wanted both of his boys, Warney and Jacksy, as Jack liked to call himself back then. He wanted his sons to receive an elite education, private education, in an all-male environment. And he thought that this would give them quite an advantage socially and educationally and vocationally as well. And there, he thought they could learn how to look and speak like very cultivated gentlemen. Okay, so they could join the upper middle class, if not higher. Okay. Now, furthermore, a man who had been a tutor to Lewis's father, a man named William Kirkpatrick, who had been a former headmaster of a school where Albert, the father, had attended as a youth. William Kirkpatrick advised that it would be good for the boys. Now, again, Jack is 9. His brother is, I think, 2 years, 3 years older, so he's only 11 or 12. But William Kirkpatrick advised his father that it would be good for the boys to make it on their own. One's 9 years old. And he said, that would be good if you sent them away to a boarding school in another country. And then they would so much look forward to coming back home periodically. It would seem like a holiday, to go back home. So I'm not sure how wise that advice was. But anyway, that's what happened. And it was absolutely a very unnerving experience, being sent away from home as a child to basically a foreign country. The headmaster, by the way, of that school was an Anglican clergyman named Reverend Robert Capron, who the other kids referred to as Oldie. So I guess they thought he was, just ancient and, out of touch with, modern concepts and whatever. But once he got there to the school, Jack wrote to his father back in Northern Ireland, quote, I think I will be able to get on with Mr. Capron through, though to tell the truth, he is rather eccentric. But within just a few days, after observing this headmaster who would regularly vent his outrage and anger against the kids in the school, Jack was absolutely terrified. Again, he's 9 years old, living in a foreign country, and he's, studying under a headmaster who seems to be an absolute tyrant. The man was a pathological and hypocritical brute who spouted scripture while flogging the children. And apparently, he really enjoyed flogging children for even the most minor infractions. In particular, he abused some of the poorest and some of the most vulnerable of the children in the school. And according to Lewis's older brother, Warney, quote, he was the most complete domestic tyrant I've ever met with or even read about. And in his autobiography, Lewis describes the school as basically a concentration camp. Fortunately for his older brother, Warney's able to transfer to another school the next year, but Jack has to stay there for 2 more years. Okay? And it must have been just absolutely terrifying. So you can imagine the psychological impact this would have. The effect of the environment on a very sensitive young man was traumatic. To cope with the situation, Lewis learned to shut off all of his emotions. One of his biographers, George Sayer wrote perhaps the best biography of C.S. Lewis, of all the biographies that have been written. Sayer's biography, it's called simply Jack, is I think the best one. Sayer writes, quote, it tears the heart to think what Jack must have suffered. The whole period of his mother's illness had been an absolute nightmare, for he had become very close to her since his older brother Warren had been sent away to school a year or so earlier. Now she had just died, and the sensitive little boy, who had never been away from home before, except with his mother, was taken away from his governess and the happy attic, the old, the end room in the attic that he had made his own, to live under the eye of a brutal and probably insane tyrant of a headmaster. And so, what's a little kid to do? Well, in desperation, Lewis says that for several weeks he devoted himself almost constantly to prayer and the Bible reading. When charges of child abuse threatened to shut the school down, then his father, Albert, had no choice but to transfer Jack to another boarding school in England. By the way, a few years after that, Oldie, the headmaster, was declared insane and spent a couple of years, in what they called back then, a sanitarium, whatever they called it. Now, Lewis returns to Belfast in 1910, and he enrolls in Campbell College. Now, that's not a college like we think of college as being higher education. He's very happy there at Campbell. It was only about a mile from where he grew up, their old bungalow that they nicknamed Little Lee. And so he could, even though it was another boarding school, he had to stay there, every day, every night, the whole time. He at least was able to go back home on Sundays. So that was quite a relief for him. But the climate, we're told, in Belfast wasn't good for his health. So his father arranged for him to attend another prep school, and this was in Malvern, England. It's a prep school by the name of Cherbourg Academy. Now, by the time Lewis gets there to Cherbourg, he is, quote, as he would describe it, he had become a, quote, naughty boy in the throes of pre-adolescent rebellion. Now, he was dazzlingly clever and witty. He was also dazzlingly profane. And already smoking cigarettes. So let's see, at this point he's about, well, he's 10 years old. That's probably when most of us, started. So he's beginning to smoke cigarettes, and he's learned all these interesting dirty words that he loves spreading around in his conversation. He's a precocious student. He excels in Latin and English in particular. And this is a time when he enters into the classical period of his education. In other words, um, although that sense of joy that we talked about so much last week, that sense of joy, remember, that he experienced when his brother, made that little garden, you know, that had long since vanished from his life. Um, and that whole sense of wonderment, what he calls, sense of joy, had pretty much evaporated. But his imagination here at Scharberg Academy is going to be rekindled when he discovers Norse mythology. And this is his imaginative renaissance, as he would later say, in which he was just absolutely enchanted by the heroic dramas in Nordic mythology. So he just finds this absolutely fascinating, as many people have. And of course, later in his life, one of his closest friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, will especially be influenced by Nordic mythology and some of the works that he produces, including, of course, The Lord of the Rings. Now, about the same time, and in keeping with his fascination with everything Nordic, Lewis discovers the music of Richard Wagner, the first great musical passion of his life. Let's see, those of you fairly familiar with Richard Wagner and his music, how would you describe it? Well, let me give you a hint. Richard Wagner was Hitler's favorite composer, and it was very what we'd call, martial type music. Okay, um, yeah, very militaristic type of music and all. But they are great works of composition. And although a lot of Wagner's music was very dark and very pessimistic, Lewis was absolutely enraptured by it because it really sparked his imagination and drew him into another world, the world of mysticism and so on, and a world, many, many centuries earlier and so on. And in particular, he's intrigued by Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung, the theme of which was a magic ring and the murder and the intrigue surrounding those who coveted this magic ring. Now, again, that sounds just like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, doesn't it? Okay. Wagner's music also reinforced his sense of being special or superior, perhaps, as it was a lot too sophisticated and intelligent for most of his peers at the time. Okay, so most little, teenagers had no interest in music like that, but it really just inspires Lewis well beyond, his chronological age and so on. Most significantly, this is also the period in which Lewis, as he describes it, he ceased to be a Christian under the influence of three factors, which you see there in your outline notes. And in fact, these three factors merely fed an already what he calls desperate anxiety to rid himself of any kind of residual Christian influences. Remember when his mother was so sick for months and months, and he prayed so earnestly for her healing. And as he writes in his autobiography, the thing didn't work. She died anyway. And then he sent off to this almost immediately. Then he sent off to some, militaristic boarding school in a foreign country. So you can readily understand why he felt, if there was a God, this is a God that may be great, but apparently he's not that good, to subject him to this kind of trauma. so early in his life. So there's three influences, three factors that really lead him to a total rejection of Christianity. And first of all, is what he describes as a generally dark and cynical view of the cosmos, reinforced no doubt by his mother's death, his father's abandonment. Basically, his father just thrown him out of the house, and they rarely saw each other after that. And then, of course, those horrible experiences in the first, private school that he attended. So this cynical view of life was developed early in life and derives from the frustrations of everyday life, a sense that the whole cosmos is frustratingly dysfunctional. Nothing seems to work in this world like we would wish it did. Sensing that the world is, quote, a menacing and an unfriendly place, full of dangerous things and dangerous people. He's gradually forming what we would call a naturalistic worldview, a naturalistic, materialistic, basically an atheistic worldview, a godless world. So he's beginning to believe that he lives in a godless world and that the forces of evil are far more powerful than the forces of good, for instance. This sense that no one or no thing is in control seems to be confirmed in the common, ordinary challenges of everyday life. And so here's again this young teenager at the time. And even as a child, though, he's discovered that, quote, whatever you wanted to remain straight tends to bend, and whatever you try to bend flies back straight. Not sure exactly what he has in mind, but I guess, we've all experienced that. All knots that you wish to be firm come untied, and all knots that you want to untie remain firm. Nothing works like we wish it did. Most foods that taste bad are good for you, and most foods that taste good are bad. A child's natural impulse is to play imaginatively, but we force them into a structured, institutionalized schools with regimented schedules that suppress their creativity and imagination. Interesting, huh? Let me read that again. A child's natural impulse is to play imaginatively. I think I shared last week about my first 5 years. Um, oh, I just lived in an imaginary world that was so safe and comfortable and enjoyable. And I had all my little toy soldiers and my record player and all this sort of thing. And then I was ordered out of the house by my parents to go to kindergarten. And, you know, they really built it up as if this was going to be really, really cool. And I remember after about 2 weeks, I told my parents that, okay, I've been there and done that, and I don't find anything interesting about it. And so they insisted I continue going anyway. And so I began standing over the heater some mornings and getting my head real hot. And I would tell my mother that I had a headache and couldn't go to school. And so that worked one or two times. And then she very astutely, caught on to what was going on. But, living in a world of mystery and imagination was just, so cool instead of the regimented schedule of even kindergarten. By the way, I did pass that year. I did pass. I was promoted the next year, first grade, so I was well on my way academically and so on. Anyway, he he's really, really struggling in so many ways. He has this very mentally active, vivid imagination and all, but he goes to school and everything is regimented. Okay, and so again, the world's not working like he thinks it ought to work. And later, a few years later, of course, he's going to go into puberty, and his natural desires, sex, have to be repressed. And he wonders why, I mean, if it's a natural desire and it's natural, then it can't be wrong, right? So anyway, he's obviously struggling. Second factor involved in his turning away from Christianity involves the school matron, a young woman by the name of Miss Cowie. And he describes Miss C as an ideal big sister. She was very bright, very friendly, very inquisitive. Apparently, she really took interest in these little kids and so on. And in reality, she serves Lewis more as a kind of surrogate mother than anything else. Unfortunately, though, her spiritual life had left her, quote, floundering in the mazes of theosophy, that's a form of the occult, spiritualism, and the whole occultic tradition. So she's very much into the occult, but she acts real nice and all to these little children, and so he finds the occult rather interesting and attractive. And the impact of this exposure to an alternative spirituality, well, that marks a significant turning point away from outright atheism to believe, oh, well, apparently this world is not all there is. There is a supernatural spiritual realm of reality. So in that sense, perhaps you might say that Miss Cowie had a quote positive impact. It takes him out of hardcore atheism. Okay. Um, he puts it this way: I passed into the cool evening of higher thought, kind of like the New Age movement and so on. I passed into the cool evening of higher thought, where there was nothing to be obeyed and nothing to be believed, except what was either comforting or exciting. So Miss Cowie's into that, as New Agers would, many New Agers would be today, and that is, your impulses should guide your life, and whatever you wish to believe is just as valid as any so-called authoritative, ideas and so on. So we're born to just follow our emotions and our impulses. Okay, and nothing is absolutely objectively right and wrong. It all depends on, again, our feelings and so on. So it's a very comfortable way of thinking for a little while until we come to the realization it doesn't square with reality. Now, thirdly, was his study of pagan Greco-Roman classical literature, which led him to conclude that all religions are just sheer illusion. He puts it this way: the impression I got was that religion in general was a natural growth, a kind of endemic nonsense into which humanity tended to blunder. We'd like to believe that somebody or something is in control of this world, in control of this universe, and we'd like to think that that somebody or something is, quote, good. So you can see the appeal here. He says, in the midst of 1,000 such religions stood our own religion, Christianity, which people think is true. But on what grounds could I believe in this exception? In other words, there's so many options out there for religion, and why should one claim to be the truth, and why should you believe that? People have all kinds of varying opinions. So he concluded that Christianity was no better than any other religion. Cumulatively, these three factors now lead Lewis to renounce Christianity And although occultism and atheism are absolutely antithetical, in other words, atheism holds there is no spiritual world. The occultism says essentially everything is spiritual. So they're antithetical. They do share one thing in common, however, and that is they are both what? Well, explicitly anti-Christian. Yeah, atheism and the occult. They have that in common at least. And anyway, as Lewis later writes, he himself he withdrew himself from divine protection, and he dropped his faith with no sense of loss, but with the greatest relief. And you hear this a lot from atheists who will talk about how once they stopped struggling with religion, Christianity, including moral absolutes, oh, it was such a relief. And Bruce, we've talked about several, top atheists like Thomas Nagel and people like that who say, once they renounced all belief in God, wow, what a relief. They could think anything, do anything they wanted without any kind of guilt, you might say. So this is the point that Lewis is reaching, but again, he's only about 13, 14, 15 years old at this point. Now, excuse me, but let me pass around this class roll because we do need to get it updated. Thanks. And if you will, just check, it's alphabetical by last name. And if you will, just, if it's correct, then just check it off. But if perchance we have the wrong email address for you, if you will, just cross it out and write in the correct one. So thank you. So I guess if we start there and go all the way back and then try to maintain some kind of orderly process, passing it around, that'll be good. All right, so Lewis has come to the conclusion that Christianity is no better than any other religion. They're all, quote, oppressive. Whereas, following what we'd call today kind of a new age mentality, you're pretty free to believe anything you please. It's kind of a smorgasbord, spirituality. And so he's lost his true faith. And that results in a couple of other consequences. And number one is that under the influence of a young headmaster there at the school, he adopts the mannerisms of a young sophisticate. Now, remember, he's going to a very elite school and mostly upper middle class and upper class students and so on. He begins wearing very flashy clothes. He begins keeping up with all the latest pop culture fads. And he also, we're told, is cursing habitually. Okay, yes. He's probably about 13 or 14 at this point. Yeah. Lewis puts it this way: I began to make myself into a fop, a cad, and a snob. Okay. Secondly, he becomes absolutely obsessed with sexual and sadistic fantasies. He becomes an habitual masturbator and fixates on what he describes to one of his friends as the sensuality of cruelty. And I won't go into the details, obviously, here, but one of his biographers writes that, quote, the objects of Jack's flagellant fantasies seem always to have been beautiful women. It's easy to identify elements that contributed to the development of his sadomasochistic tendencies, which most notably, was that he was forced to witness countless beatings back at that first school he went to. Remember, he's only 9 years old and he's seeing this big old adult, whip these kids and everything. And as gross as it is, I suppose I don't know, he found it fascinating or something. That lack of civility and decency and so on. Um, and others talk about, the loss of his mother being a major factor in his psychological maladjustments and so on. Um, but it's hard to analyze all this. One of his biographers says such theories are a matter for psychologists to argue over. Okay, so anyway, at this point, he's about 14 years old, and he wins a classical scholarship to Malvern College. Again, not a college as we think of it, post high school as we call it. But like all elite schools, Malvern College was a hyper competitive environment. And the students who really dominated the campus were students that Lewis refers to as the Bloods, capital B. In other words, upperclassmen who were excellent athletes. And Lewis puts it this way. He says the whole school was a great temple for the worship of these mortal gods, these athletes, okay, who were the embodiment of all worldly pomp and power and glory. I mean, they got all the attention on campus and so on. And, we certainly that's the case in American education oftentimes as well. Lewis was a large boy for his age, but he was very, very uncoordinated and extremely non-athletic. He hated what he called, quote, games, and he resented the privileges bestowed upon these athletes, whom he regarded as ignorant Philistines. Okay, so, they may be impressive physically, but most of them are not very smart. In fact, I'm not sure why they're even here. Now that's one group, and they pretty much dominate the school. And again, that would be the case in so many American schools, wouldn't it? But there was another significant group on campus, and these were the kids that were generically referred to as the tarts, or fags, is the word they used back then. The small, effeminate underclassmen who served the Bloods. They performed menial tasks for their superiors, shining their shoes, running their errands, doing their homework, things like that. Privately, homosexual harassment and exploitation was common, although publicly it certainly was never acknowledged. But we've heard all about this probably your whole life about elite English education, and how prevalent homosexuality supposedly was. Now, one of Lewis's biographers, George Sayer, writes, quote, a primary source of strife for Jack was his obsession with sex. From the very first night there at Malvern College, when glances from older boys aroused his suspicions, he supposed that homosexuality was a common practice. But his notion of what went on was based more on fantasy than on fact. And in fact, several of Lewis's biographers say that apparently he overemphasized that factor. It wasn't as prevalent as he thought, back then. But nonetheless, he's in an environment that's pretty intimidating. You got the big, strong athletes, and then you've got the, as they called them back then, the tarts. And so, again, what an environment, to try and grow and mature normally. Lewis resented the culture of elitism that characterized these public schools. The British call them public, they're actually private schools. He considered it to be a major contributing factor to all of the social snobbery and all the classism in British society. Well, certainly there was a direct correlation there. He later commented that, quote, spiritually speaking, the deadly thing was that school life was a life almost entirely dominated by the social struggle. And from it, at school as well as in the world, all sorts of meanness flow. So, in his mind at least, and again, consider that he's a very, very sensitive character, and all he sees is a lot of kids exploiting, taking advantage of one another. And it has quite an impact on him. So Lewis is neither an athlete nor is he a tart. So he exists outside the circles of popularity. Nonetheless, at least some of his peers found him to be quite an interesting guy. One person later wrote, he was a bit of a rebel. He had a wonderful sense of humor. I think he took his work seriously, but nothing else. He didn't take anything else seriously. When I knew him, I can only describe him as a riotously amusing atheist. He really was pretty foul-mouthed about it all. Okay. So in his year there at Malvern, and partly in order to maintain a sense of self-respect in the midst of what otherwise was a rather demoralizing and degrading social system, he becomes a, quote, highbrow who looks down on the campus Philistines with great disdain. So the way he tried to cope with his situation was, hey, look, I'm a whole lot smarter than all these kids are. So they really, that's the basis for my self-respect. I'm a lot smarter than they. Okay. He's a brilliant student. He has is that my jacket over there calling me? My apologies. Okay. Somebody's calling me on the phone across the room there. That's okay. So here's a kid who is a brilliant student. He has a very keen appreciation of art. He even, literature and music. He even enjoys, Richard Wagner's classical themes and so on. Under the influence of one of his teachers, he develops a very deep love for poetry, especially the poetry of John Milton and William Butler Yeats. Yeats, by the way, was very much into the occult too. And that's one thing that kind of drew Lewis toward, Yeats. Also, he's influenced at this time the Celtic mythology, which he came to cherish as much as he cherished and admired Norse mythology as well. Biographer George Sayers says, we shall not understand Jack until we appreciate his gift for being utterly absorbed in the imaginative world of a great writer, artist, and musician. Although he flourishes intellectually there at that college, he's profoundly unhappy there. And so he begs his father, please take me out of this place, please let me withdraw. And on one occasion, he even told his father that if he didn't get out of that school, he was going to commit suicide. So with that, his father, of course, relents. And partly on the advice of his father's old mentor, who I mentioned a while ago, a man named William Kirkpatrick. William Kirkpatrick had observed, we all know that the public schools, the elite private schools, turn out boys so completely molded in the same pattern that they suggest productions from an automatic machine. It's like going to school, it's like, being processed in a machine. Individuality is discouraged, or rather finds it impossible to take root in such soil. And so his father, Albert, had studied under this William Kirkpatrick many, many years earlier. He referred to William Kirkpatrick as the Great Knock. And during that period, Kirkpatrick had been charged with preparing Lewis's father for entry into a university, and apparently he did a brilliant job. So Lewis had grown up hearing about the Great Knock and how great he was. And he had in his mind a very clear impression of what he was in for when his father sent him off to study under this professional tutor, William Kirkpatrick. In particular, Lewis remembered his father's story about how on one occasion, old Knock had taken him aside to comfort him, given him a tender hug and whispered a few words of comfort in his ear. Now, his father used to like to relate that story, but we find out later, well, that was the only time old Knock ever did that. Okay. Other than that, he was pretty detached and pretty impassive and all, but he was not necessarily a mean man, but he was a very harsh man. And but Lewis had heard that story so many times about how on one occasion this tutor, brings his father over and gives him a hug and lets him know how much he cares for him and so on. Lewis thought, well, that's kind of the general the general state of mind of this man, but in fact, it's not the case at all. Lewis imagined that the quote arch sentimentalist would be very warm, very cuddly, and eager to greet him with open arms when he showed up. So, life and reality will intrude at that point. So you have there in your study guide the short article on page 9, Encountering the Great Knock. And I have to tell you, this is one of the most impactful things I think I've ever read and taught in my life. And so I hope it impacts you as it has me in the past. So this is excerpted from Lewis's Surprised by Joy autobiography, chapter 9. And at this point, as you see there, if you're following along, at this point in his autobiography, Lewis is 15 years old now. He's just left boarding school, and he's traveled by train to meet his new private tutor, William Kirkpatrick, under whom his father had studied for many years earlier. Okay. So this is what Lewis writes, quote, "At Bookham, I was met by my new teacher, Kirk, or the Great Knock, as my father and I called him. I had heard about him all my life, and I therefore thought I had a clear impression of what I was in for. He was over 6 feet tall, very shabbily dressed. I thought he looked like a gardener. Back in those days, even gardeners, oftentimes put on a tie and all and go out and do their work, We shook hands. And though his grip was like iron pincers, it was not lingering. A few minutes later, we were walking away from the station. Now, you are now, said Kirk, proceeding along the main artery between Great and Little Bookham, the village. I stole a glance at him. I began to, quote, make conversation in the deplorable manner which I had acquired at evening parties, just, small talk and so on. I said I was surprised at the, quote, scenery around this area, around Surrey. It was a lot, quote, wilder than I had expected. Stop, shouted Kirk with a suddenness that made me jump. What do you mean by wildness, and what grounds had you for not expecting it? So, Lewis, he's only 15 years old. He's just trying to make, conversation. And immediately this tutor challenges him on just a casual comment about the surrounding area. I replied that I really didn't know what I meant, still making conversation. As answer after answer was torn to shreds, it at last dawned upon me that he really wanted to know where had I gotten my impression of this area. He was not making conversation, not joking, nor snubbing me. He wanted to know. I was stung into attempting a real answer. A few passes sufficed to show that I actually had no clear and distinct idea corresponding to the word wildness. And that insofar as I had any idea at all, wildness was a totally inept word. Do you not see then, concluded the Great Knock, that your remark was meaningless? I prepared to sulk. assuming that the subject would be dropped. Never was I more mistaken in all my life. Having analyzed my terms, Kirk then was proceeding to deal with my proposition as a whole. On what had I based, or based, as he put it, my expectations about the flora and the geology of Surrey? Was it that I had been studying maps or photographs or books? Well, I could produce none. It had, heaven help me, and this is the key sentence, it had, heaven help me, never occurred to me that what I called my thoughts needed to be based on anything. They're just my thoughts, just my feelings or impressions. Kirk once more drew a conclusion without the slightest sign of emotion, but equally without the slightest concession to what I thought was good manners. And this is what he says. Do you not see then that you had no right to have an opinion whatever on the subject? Think about that. You don't know anything about this place, and yet you make this comment, and it's totally baseless. You have no right to have an opinion. You've never been here. You haven't studied it, read about this place or anything. Now, by this point, our acquaintance had lasted about 3.5 minutes. But the tone set by that first conversation was preserved without a single break during all the years that I spent there in Bookham. The most casual remark was taken as a summons to disputation. You couldn't say anything to this man unless you were prepared to defend what you said. Interesting.
This is like tactics that students sort of discipling in.
Yeah, in other words, his view would be, I don't care about your feelings and whatever. Let's stay in the realm of reality, of facts and logic. So if you're going to say anything, it's got to be based on facts and reason, logic, so on, or else don't opine, on anything. Yes, Bruce?
Yeah, just a couple of things. The movie that came out a couple of years ago, The Most Reluctant Convert, if you haven't seen it, by all means, it will flesh out your ideas in the plot. But the section where he meets Nam is really quite absolutely extraordinary. It's beautifully done. Then he was taken into his home. His wife took care of him. He had his own bedroom. He had access to Kirkpatrick's library. They walked in the field and they taught. They had lessons and so forth. So he just learned a phenomenal amount. But one famous story that Lewis recounts, I don't know whether he had this happen to him or not, but someone recounted that Kirkpatrick was having an argument with somebody about something, as he no doubt did quite often. Right?
Probably.
The man was looking for an argument, and finally the guy, his interlocutor got frustrated and said, "Well, that's just your opinion." And apparently not put his hands on it and said, "Sir, I have no opinions."
Yeah, yeah. I have no opinions. I just know facts. And I use reason and logic. Okay. How many people have you ever known in life who had anything like that orientation? So in the past, when I've taught on this, encountering the great knock, there's a couple of questions I've asked. I wanted to ask you all as well. And those of you joining us online, please feel free to unmute if you have something to say directly about this. And the first question is, if you had been Lewis, he's only 15 years old, what would you have thought of Kirk's response to your innocent comment about the scenery around Surrey, which was much, quote, wilder than you had expected? What would you have thought of his response?
Free church, right?
Well, and he had no cell phone, so he couldn't call Uber, immediately and get me out of here. Pardon me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Invalidating.
yeah, invalidating, belittling. But again, the great knock, Kirkpatrick, see, he doesn't see his role being uh, what catering to his to Lewis's feelings and whatever. He's being paid to teach him how to think. And that would put him in a class and a category unlike 99+% of humanity. Okay. So he sees that as his mission, basically. But you're right. I mean, of course, Lewis was just exceptionally brilliant as a child. Most kids, I imagine, would have just absolutely collapsed and, you know, and all. But perhaps Kirkpatrick knew enough about Lewis to know that he can handle it. Perhaps, yeah.
Like nice, like the small talk. Maybe it was actually like, whoa. This is maybe, maybe Lewis actually, after the initial shock, was like,
Hmm.
because he could hang with that. He had the chops up here.
Yeah, eventually he'll learn a great deal, and in fact, he'll consider William Kirkpatrick to be one of the greatest influences in his life. This man taught him how to think, not just to emote, to say the least.
And
Yes.
I've often, since I first learned about Knox some years ago, some of the things that we like most about Lewis's writing, it's clarity, it's clear thought, it's logic, it's staying within the bounds of what's known, all those sorts of things. They're all things that point out from Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that we don't pay enough attention to. I
Mm-hmm.
have a little tick. When I talk to people, I'll tell them sometimes, I'm about to tell you 150% of what I know. Because I may know A and I may know B, and if A is true and B is true, then C is probably true.
Mm-hmm.
But if B is true and C is probably true, then D is less likely to be true. And the further you get out this line, and people don't make that distinction anymore. They just think they heard something somewhere, they haven't investigated, they don't know where it came from, they don't know what it holds together logically or functionally or anything like that. And you're just hearing this stuff. It has no, contradiction after contradiction,
Mm-hmm.
and especially if you watch the news and stuff like that. It's just,
And what's their
Mhm.
source? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just endless. It could be anything. You can find anything out there
Yeah.
to back up anything.
Mm-hmm.
To believe.
Well, and when you think of classical education, and obviously William Kirkpatrick is all invested in classical education, and he'll do a great job in teaching Lewis about the classics. What was considered the king of the sciences throughout the Middle Ages? Now, let me give you a hint. The queen of the sciences was theology. What was the king? Philosophy. Yeah. Being able to think and express oneself clearly. Yeah. And we lost that 200 years ago in American education. And of course, because it's the king of all the sciences, obviously, along with theology, it's going to be prime target for Satan to corrupt and pervert. And of course, Satan has succeeded brilliantly to the point where most people never even take a philosophy course in college or anything, high school or college or whatever. So, boy, this is a totally different mindset than is prevalent today and prevalent, frankly, over the last 150, 200 years. Was Kirkpatrick right to confront young Lewis as he did? What do you think? Think he was?
Teach him to think that,
Mhm.
yes, from the very beginning, he wasn't there to cuddle him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think he had a very clear mandate here, and that is don't just tolerate, any silly thing that this boy says or does, but basically command that he think and act like an adult. Um, there's a common saying, everybody's entitled to his or her own opinion. Do you agree? Pardon me?
Out to it, and maybe you shouldn't necessarily say it.
Um, uh, yeah, what should be the basis for our opinions and our beliefs? It should be facts, right? It should be the truth, facts as they relate to reality. You know, when we're teaching Christian apologetics, we always try to emphasize that when all is said and done, there's really only one reason that you should ever consider being a Christian. And that one reason is, does the Christian faith comport to reality? Is it true? See? Otherwise, this is just a total waste of time, you know, and being involved in your church, what a waste of time. If Christianity does not comport to reality with a capital R or truth with a capital T. Okay. Um, uh, so what's the main point that Lewis is trying to make when he related this story? Well, again, as you mentioned, you know, he met somebody who wasn't interested in coddling him, and somebody who was demanding that if you're going to say something, then have facts to back it up, or reason, facts and reason, you know. Otherwise, it's not a credible thing that you're saying. If you said, I love the music of Richard Wagner, really? Why? You know, defend yourself. What is it you see in that composer that is worthy of your, you know, attention whatsoever? Oh, Wagner? It's like Wagner.
Oh.
Yeah, Wagner. Yeah. Late 1800s, basically. Yeah, yeah. Bruce?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, for those who don't know anything about Wagner, he was a man who did everything in extremes. And his music was overbearing. He would have multiple orchestras, legions of singers, a lot of operas on esoteric Norse mythology and all these sorts of things. And at the time, many times confusing harmonies. It was a bit like if you went to an IMAX theater these days, they put every speaker in the house on in full blast. That was what going to a Wagner opera was like, except it lasted 2.5 to 3 hours. And you come out just completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And he was very popular in his own way, but often popular with people who lived on the sort of the dark side. Like there was a French school of poets that liked, that loved him and idolized him, you know, and they were known as the decadent school.
Well, as would be the case with militarists like Hitler and the Nazis. Yeah. Well, lastly, why do you think Lewis considered his relationship with the Great Knock to be a generally positive influence on his personal growth and development? Well, I think we've pretty much, you know, touched on that. And that is, this man demanded that you think before you speak, think before you write, okay, and be prepared to defend things. So even though Kirkpatrick was not a Christian, apparently he must have thought that there's absolute right and wrong, which is, of course, a foundation for the Christian faith itself. But anyway, imagine how shocked Lewis must have been by their initial encounter at the train station. Kirkpatrick was certainly eccentric, shabbily dressed, and he smelled of pipe tobacco. He had no interest in frivolous conversation and absolutely disdained small talk. Kirkpatrick, an old-fashioned 19th century rationalist, was a former Presbyterian minister, but a practicing atheist. Nonetheless, he retained some semblance of respect for his tradition, his faith tradition, because while working in the garden on Sundays, he always wore a slightly more respectable suit. So he would dress a little nicer on Sundays when he goes out to do his gardening work and so on. So for the next 2.5 years, he subjected Lewis to rigorous, unrelenting interrogation. Lewis writes, the most casual remark was taken as a summons to disputation. You know, you better be prepared to defend everything you say, even that was a wonderful meal. Oh, really? Why do you think it was a wonderful, you know, what's your basis for believing that was a wonderful meal, you know? He says, refutation always followed the same lines. Had I read that? Had I studied it? Did I have any statistical evidence for what I said? Had I any evidence in my own experience? If not, the conclusion was always the same. Don't you see that you have no right to that opinion? It was a continuous astonishment to him that anyone should not desire to be clarified or corrected. So Lewis is saying years later, he according to the Great Knock, you know, he couldn't imagine why anybody would find this oppressive or whatever. You know, this is reality. So get with it, you know. Over time, as Lewis developed his, quote, intellectual muscle, which he certainly did, he mastered the art of verbal defense. In contrast to his previous experiences, life with the great Knox was, quote, settled, calm, and Epicurean, and Lewis flourished. Lewis worked his way through Greek and Latin classics in addition to studying French, German, and Italian. And the two form a very, very close mutual admiration society in the process, as Lewis impressed Kirkpatrick with his keen mind and his high academic standards. Years later, in his autobiography, Lewis would wrote, quote, "My debt to him is very great. My reverence to this day is undiminished." So this is a man who challenged him and made him grow up in every area of life, essentially. Here, this is funny. This is another thing that I appreciate so much about Lewis. According to Lewis, Old Knox's worst flaw was his lack of respect for the bodies of books. Lewis had grown to cherish his books and to savor their individual aesthetic and sensual features, the aesthetic and the sensual features of a book. The way the book looked and felt and smelled. I'm not sure I would agree with that. As well as, quote, the differing sounds that different papers make as you turn the pages. Interesting, huh? Kirkpatrick, however, had a strictly pragmatic and utilitarian relationship with books. How often have I shuddered, he says, Lewis says, when Kirkpatrick took a new book, a new text of mine, in his gardener's hands, bent back the cover till it cracked, and left his sign on every page. I guess his dirty hands and whatever. So let's see, I have often said that it's interesting what we retain in our education. So here's a book, and of all the thousands of books that I have ever opened in my life, I never open them in the middle and crack the spine. You always open just a few pages and press it down. And then you take a few more pages and press it down. Okay. And one more time. No, I'm being honest. Okay, and so on. Uh, Lewis would say that's a show of respect for this book. You don't treat it disrespectfully, you know. And I learned that in second grade. And I've never opened a book, I don't think, in my whole life that I didn't do that. Even trigonometry books. Not that I had any respect for them. Now let me wrap things up here with the other article you see there in your study guide on page 10. I find this to be about as impactful as what we just previously read and discussed about his encounter with the Great Knock. Now, this is an academician by the name of Eugene Genovese on the value of academic debate. Now, Eugene Genovese was one of the premier American Marxist historians. He had a long teaching career beginning in the 1950s. It ended in the late 1990s, or I don't know, it might have continued on into the early 20th century. And like I said, he was one of the renowned Marx, if you can use renowned and Marxist together. Anyway, he was highly respected in left-wing Marxist circles. I'll mention something else about him in a few minutes. But here's my comment. Contrast the current pathology of hypersensitivity in education and American society in general with the comments of the historian Eugene Genovese. Now, like C.S. Lewis's tutor, the Great Knock, Genovese had no tolerance for coddling students. As he saw it, true education challenges students to grow and mature not only intellectually, but also emotionally. In this brief excerpt from an article he wrote for the New Republic in 1991, Genovese reminisces about the rough and tumble world of higher education that he experienced as an undergraduate student at Brooklyn College. And this is what he writes. And again, this is like another world, what we've experienced in recent, decades. At Brooklyn College, which I attended in the late 1940s, everyone took for granted that students ought to challenge their professors and each other. Professors acted as if they were paid to assault their students' sensibilities, to offend their most cherished values. The classroom was an ideological war zone, and self-respecting students returned the blows. In this way, we had a chance to acquire a first-rate education. That is, to learn to sustain ourselves in combat against dedicated professors who lacked the time and the, quote, tolerance to worry about our feelings. Thus, I submit that the first law of college teaching is this: any professor who, subject to the restraints of common sense and common decency, of course, does not seize every opportunity to offend the sensibilities of his students is insulting them and cheating them, and is no college professor at all. Can you believe that? I mean, this was America of 80 years ago. Now, look at the postscript, if you will. Genovese, a renowned neo-Marxist historian, experienced a political conversion to traditional conservatism in the early 1990s that soon led to a spiritual conversion to Catholic Christianity in 1996. His wife, academic collaborator and soulmate, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, also experienced both a political and a spiritual conversion. Elizabeth Fox Genovese actually started the Women's Studies program at Emory University. Then she converts to a more conservative political orientation, and then she becomes a Christian. And so by, let's see, when was this? By about at least the late 1990s, if not the early 2000s, the department that she had founded there at Emory, the Women's Studies department, forced her out because she wasn't, trendy and radical like all of them were. But sometime, you'd probably find it very interesting to read about Eugene Genovese and Elizabeth Fox Genovese. Really extraordinary people. Now, when we started the Areopagus, we started a series of forums, monthly forums, and we would invite in, outside speakers and all. And I called Eugene Genovese. He was still living here in Atlanta. His wife had died just not long prior to that. And he just told me that he just really wasn't feeling like going out and, speaking publicly and everything. He was pretty old and, just not feeling like it. But I really was sorry that was the case. I would have loved to have brought him in and had some serious conversations with him. Because like I said, he was wholesale Marxist for most of his career. But you know why I respected him is because as a graduate student, I was doing a lot of research. I was a history, got a PhD in history, and I was reading a lot about slavery and the Civil War, pre-Civil War, and so on. And he wrote one of the major treatments on the history of slavery in America, especially in the years just preceding the Civil War. And so I'm reading this book on slavery by this Marxist historian, and I'm thinking, this is amazingly objective and fair, unlike anything you would expect a Marxist to write. And so at that point, I realized, there must be some desire on his part, not to just push a far left-wing Marxist agenda, but to actually, uncover the truth of the past. He was very fair in his treatment when it came to slavery and slave owners, and that, of course, is rather unusual. So I kind of grudgingly, he earned my respect in that respect. And then later I found out about his conversion to Christianity. So, but can you imagine Brooklyn College, 1940s, and everybody is arguing. Students are arguing and challenging professors, and professors are arguing, challenging students. It must have been quite a sight to behold, and just so radically different from the mentality by the time I started teaching, in college, which was in the mid 80s, actually. So times they had changed. Well, any other thoughts? So we've got just 2 or 3 minutes before our time elapses. And also those of you joining us online, again, great to see you. Any comments you might have? Any questions or?
My question is that the C.S. Lewis about 15. What was the age difference between him and the
Kirkpatrick?
About, was it in his 50s or at that time?
The age difference between young Lewis and Kirkpatrick. I don't remember how old Kirkpatrick would have been. I guess he could have been in his 60s by then, because he had taught Lewis's father, of course, many decades earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was 48.
Oh, wow.
48.
Wow.
Oh, okay. I was thinking, he's almost he's hardly any older than I am. Hardly. 1848. Okay. Died in 1921. Okay.
Is it after C.S. Lewis converted, if he contacted right now?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think I've ever come across that.
Because he respected him, you think he'd want to share?
Yeah, he truly was a mentor intellectually, he was a mentor. And yeah, it'd be very interesting to know. Yeah. Anything else?
Do you know what would have changed Genevieve's point of view from?
What would have changed Genevieve's point of view on politics and more importantly, on Christianity? If I ever read any of the details, I don't remember, but it'd be worth going back and reading about. Yeah. You know, we think of Marxist intellectuals and academics as being just crazed lunatics, which 99% probably are. But, you know, everybody is different. I mean, everybody's unique. And so here you have somebody who, you know, when you study Karl Marx's writings, see, there is so much to criticize, and rightly so, to say the least. But he was absolutely right that up until he started focusing on it, social class conflicts were usually not considered a major driving force in history, but they were periodically sometimes. And so he brings to the forefront class conflict as well. In his mind, it's the driving force in all of history. Now, that's a gross exaggeration. It's not the driving force in history, but it is a significant factor. And Karl Marx was the one who really emphasized that. He overemphasized it, of course. But again, you know, we can learn from most anyone. And again, when I was in grad school, I was studying political philosophy, and I read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1775, kind of the progenitor of, you know, modern capitalism. And then, of course, I read Karl Marx's works, Communist Manifesto and parts of Das Kapital. And you know what really struck me? The difference, well, I mean, there's so many differences between Adam Smith and Karl Marx, capitalism and communism. But one thing that really stood out to me was Adam Smith actually had a sense of humor. Karl Marx had no sense of humor whatsoever. I mean, he was just a hardcore dogmatist, you know. And I remember thinking, that says a lot about this character, you know. So, not to mention his screwy philosophy of history and so on. So, well, anything else? Good to see you all. Thank you for joining us. Those of you online, always wonderful to see you. And any questions or follow-up comments or anything, please let me know, and I'll get right back in touch with you. So again, if you don't have a copy of the study guide, you can go to Amazon.com, Jeffrey D. Brashear's C.S. Lewis, and this will pop up along with some other books as well. And I think you'll find it to be very valuable as we continue on through his life and works and so on. So blessings on your week. There's a lot to be thankful for this week. And again, let's pray for wise leadership and humble leadership from the top. And so much good can accrue as a result. So blessings. Good being with you all. Thank you. Good to see you all.